Welcome to Maine, we're stretched to the bone. Prices keep rising, the paycheck stays prone. Inflation keeps knocking, won't leave us alone. They're selling the lie, groceries climbing, the gas tank is low. The bill's hitting harder than snow, but silence still blankets the truth. Where does it go? They're selling the lie. Housing is gridlocked from Portland to the county. Workers commute far past what feels soundly. Talk of solution comes yearly, not loudly. They're selling the lie. They're selling the lie. Say every voice counts, but watch who gets lifted. Some stories vanish, some get the spotlight shifted. Depends on what trends and what keeps them gifted. They're selling the lie. I won't believe them, I wanna believe, but truth's always stuck in between. Static and spin, drown the signal again. Nothing is what it seems. I wanna believe you, but every headline turns daylight into redesigned skies. Facts get twisted, context missing. We choke on the simplified alibis. Wanna believe you, but all I see is shadows where the answers should shine. The fact is fiction.
Welcome to the Muddy Waters Podcast, where Mainers tell their stories, unfiltered.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, Maine. This is Chuck Ellis, and you're watching the Muddy Waters Podcast. As you all know, I say it every time, the Muddy Waters Podcast exists to help the people of Maine better understand what's going on in our state. And we do that basically, we're trying to combat the mainstream narrative, which is basically the mainstream media has become a propaganda arm of the Democrat Party. And there are certain things that they don't want you to hear. They're not highlighting conservative voices for sure. But so part of what we do is we interview people from around the state, whether they have lived here for a long period of time or just moved here, to talk about what's really going on in our state, what's going on the ground, and give you and depending on the situation, give you a sense of like who people are. So that we can get behind people and help turn our state red, essentially, is what we're trying to do, because, again, the Democrat Party has gone crazy. So anyway, I'm Chuck Ellis, and this is the Muddy Waters Podcast. Unfortunately, the guest that we have with us today is Andrew McKnight, with Turning Point Action. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation. Really excited for anybody who's willing to invest in Maine and try and bring common sense policy making to our state. Ultimately, I don't care if somebody's some of the Republicans don't always like to hear this, like if they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever. As long as they have common sense policies that are in favor of helping make Maine a better place to live and have more, policies in line with reality, and ones that are not harming people, stealing money from people, all that kind of stuff. Right now, the best bet seems to be the Republican Party, and I've been a part of it for the last 4 years, and I think there's hope there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not I think when I ran in 2022, one of my ticket items that I put was that I'm not a company man, right? Like, I don't live for the Republican Party. I live for the principles that I live for, which aligns very well right now with the principles that the Republican Party aligns with, which is why I support them, and why I'm so involved. But organizations can change over time. And so anyway, I just kind of have that caveat that I don't need. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Andrew. Yeah. I need to stop talking. And thank you for coming to Maine to try and help us out here, because we need the help.
Yeah.
Soros is dumping enough money into the state. So it'd be great to have some people with ideas that are more in line with reality and again, what's in the best interest of the people of Maine, rather than the radical policies of the Democrat Party, for instance.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely.
for
Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, so to get started, I'd love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the people of Maine. I know that you're kind of making the rounds and going around, but like, who are you? Where do you come from? And why in the world did you decide to move to Maine, of all places, especially given the radical nature of the some people call Brunswick the People's Republic of Brunswick, suggesting that it's very similar to China in terms of its communism. Same thing with Portland. I mean, Steve Robinson has said we'd be better off if we just built a wall around Portland. And so why? Who are you? Where do you come from? And why are you here? Why are you looking to engage in this whole process?
Well, I'm not supposed to tell people this, but I was actually grown in a lab at Turning Point headquarters specifically for the purpose of beating Graham Plattner. So that's why I'm here. But the cover story that we tell people is I'm from Virginia originally, Roanoke, Virginia, down in the southwest area, the Blue Ridge Mountains. Lived there my whole life. I went to Liberty University, finishing out my degree there online this year. Studied political science and philosophy, so I'm a huge nerd. Is what I tell people. Yeah, a huge political nerd. And then if you had told me 2 months ago I would be sitting here in Maine on a podcast, I would have told you were insane. But I had an internship in Richmond, which is a state capital of Virginia, lined up that I was going to do. Excited about finishing up my last year in person of school, and then I got a call from the guys at Turning Point. They said, "Hey, we've got a job." Originally they had offered me a job in North Carolina, and that was, maybe a couple hours from home, not that big of a change for me. I was like, yeah, it sounds good. Like, let's talk more about that. And they instead decided they wanted to move me to Pennsylvania, Northwest Pennsylvania, near like Erie, that area. I said, yeah, okay, whatever. Like, let's do it. And I told them during that interview that wherever you send me, I want to go to the place where I can fight Democrats, because that's what I want to do. Because I believe that the Democratic Party has become a cancer on the American body politic. I believe that the ideology that has taken hold of that party, and honestly, that's been inherent to the party's worldview for such a long time, is incompatible with polite society, with Christian civilization, with Western civilization as we know it. And after telling them that, they were like, okay, we're going to send you to Maine, where they're really insane. And so they sent me up here. I'm the first ever field rep for Turning Point Action in Maine. So I'm like laying out all the groundwork, all of the infrastructure. We're starting from scratch, but it's exciting to build something totally new, to kind of stand on my own 2 feet. That's how I got here.
Wow. So how long have you been in Maine now?
About 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks. Okay. What's the craziest thing you see about Maine since being here so far?
There's I think I've seen colors that I didn't know exist on so many different people's hairs.
How do you know you're around liberals? The different hair colors.
Yeah.
Blue hair is kind of what we usually say, but here it's like pink and purple and I don't know.
I got the whole rainbow.
The whole rainbow.
I remember I was on my way to a thing in New Hampshire. It was like my first day here in Maine. I just moved in the night before, and they had an event in New Hampshire they wanted me to come out to. And so I'm cheap, so I don't like taking the tolls. I always take the back roads. And I was driving through Kennebunkport, and while I was going through, this was like the first week of Pride Month. And I look up, and I swear there's more Pride flags hanging from the street lamps than there are American flags. And when I spoke at New Hampshire at that event, I was like, I knew I had crossed out of Maine and into New Hampshire when I stopped seeing Pride flags and started seeing American flags. And so just seeing like how conquered this state has become, that was a new experience for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to some people who are immigrants to this country, right? New legal immigrants is what we're referencing here, who look around and see the pride flags and wonder why, like, people don't have, why people aren't more proud just to be Americans, and have an American flag, right, rather than a pride flag. And it is really interesting that in many of our districts, how do you know you're going to a Republican door? Well, if there's a American flag there, there's a high probability that is actually a Republican door. If there's no flag, it's more likely you're more higher probability of independent. And if there's a pride flag, you know what you've got there, right? Like this is, and that's become their rallying cry. And what's really interesting about the Democrats at this point is they hate America, right? Like, you talked earlier, and I'd love to have more conversation around this because it's kind of what's happened in America to me over the course of the last 60 years is really fascinating. And like, if you put it into a book and called that book, say, Brave New World, people wouldn't have believed that it was coming. By the way, that book exists. Read it if you haven't already, right? But now we look back and we're like, oh my gosh, was that like a playbook? But like what the Democrats have been able to do. And I sometimes say, and some people like to correct me, that like, if you turn back the clock 25, 30 years, the major difference between the Democrat and the Republican Party is more on like, how do we accomplish the task, right? Both trying to get to the same place, the most flourishing for the most people, right? And today we have a different vision of the world. They want more transgender kids, for instance, more abortions, less children, it seems. Very like worry. They would prioritize trees over people, cats and dogs over people. Interestingly enough, and which is just really, really fascinating. But ultimately, they're looking for a different world. They have a different worldview, and we're no longer trying to get to the same place. It's a divergence, and I think what you've kind of hinted at is it's always been a divergence. They just were being less honest in the past, and they're being more honest today. Would you agree with that?
I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
There was at the end of the Clinton administration, there was a website that some leftists, they taught us about this in training at Turning Point. It was called moveon.org. And they asked us, who do you think, what are they moving on from? It was a leftist organization that was used for mobilization, organization, and activism. And the answer was they wanted to move on from Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was the archetypal establishment Democrat who, got along with the Republicans all the time, worked with the Republicans in Congress to pass laws. And the activist base of the left, the real grassroots force of the Democratic Party, couldn't abide by that. They wanted to push the envelope. They wanted to move that Overton window further and further to the left. And so they started moveon.org. And through the efforts of that organization, we got Obama 08.
Yeah, which is they got the divergence that they wanted with there. Yeah, they moved the Overton window for sure. It's so interesting that like today, typically we try to focus on Maine politics, but this is going to branch into like more the national scene. But like, what's really interesting is that people, including like Republicans, who I think have been impacted to a degree by TDS. There's a reality that his behaviors and mannerisms, there are some things that are not as good as they could be there. We'll say it politely. But anyway, but people want to claim, and they buy into this idea that Donald Trump is the reason for the division in our country. And the truth is, like, this like really caustic, at each other's throats kind of division between Democrats and Republicans in our country stems from really from that movement that you're talking about, but really Barack Obama's presidency, in which he basically radicalized people against people with traditional American values. And to the point where these crazy people will say that traditional American values are racist. And it's like, no, they're not. Like,
yeah.
It's actually idiotic to suggest that. Do we have some problems in our past? Sure. It's interesting that the Democrats would rather throw the baby out with the bathwater. They want to basically condemn anything that's ever happened in history in America before it, including the thing that allows them to think and say out loud what they believe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the reason, the ledge, the branch that they're standing on exists because of the country that America was, that created the environment. So even if you're right, you're only able to say and do what you're able to say and do because of these traditional historic American values. values, that you may disagree with some of them, but they're the reason that you can get away with saying what you're saying. Because if you were saying what you're saying in many other countries around the world,
Absolutely.
you would be dead or in jail.
Yeah.
And it's just an incredible. But the Democrats have been executing on a plan for the last, I would say, 60 years. Started with infiltrating higher education, right, and through that, infiltrating all of our institutions. What is Turning Point Action? Because obviously you work for Turning Point Action Maine. What are you guys doing? How is it that how are we pushing back against that?
Yeah. So I don't know if you have ever had any formal education in politics. You read a book called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but Saul Alinsky, he was a leftist organizer in Chicago in the 1960s.
Okay.
And he wrote this book, Rules for Radicals, to teach his students how to do what he did at the end of his life, how to move the Overton window further. Do you know what I mean when I refer to the Overton window? Yeah.
Yep.
How to move that Overton window further and further to the left. He actually, if you read the book, he dedicates it to Lucifer, the first radical, which I think is a very interesting and telling dedication.
So when people say that they're anti-God, they mean it. Anti-Christian, right?
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
dedicating the first chapter to Satan.
He dedicates the entire book to
Satan.
the first radical, the first revolutionary, Lucifer. He writes a whole poem for him. But so there's that.
War on God is a bad idea. Just throwing that out there.
But in the book, he talks about how to effectively take over the society, starting at the grassroots level and moving to the national level. And he points out the importance of the power centers, the institutions in a society, and how to take over those institutions and use them to affect both the cultural realm as well as the political realm. And he's not first to come up with this idea. There's a guy, his name escapes me. He was an Italian socialist in the 1960s. Alinsky borrows a lot from this guy.
Okay.
But taking over these power centers, we're talking about institutions like higher education, institutions like the news media, Hollywood, that kind of thing. You see a lot of guys come out of the Frankfurt School. People like George Lukács. There's another guy, Herbert Marcuse, is a big one that a lot of people talk about. Taking over institutions of higher learning, taking over the cultural institutions. And that's how the left got us to where we are today, is through taking over those power centers, identifying the power centers and staffing them with their people. Because something you learn in politics is personnel is policy. The types of people that you have in these offices are going to have a direct one-to-one correlation with what kinds of policies you're going to see out of the institutions. And so for us as conservatives and as Turning Point, we want to do that, but to good ends. We want to identify the power centers, things like the Super Bowl halftime show. That is a center of power, right? The NFL is a center of power.
Okay.
And the left has overtaken that center of power by putting in their people. Personnel is policy, so we get the Bad Bunny halftime show. And so what we want to do instead is create our own centers of power so that we can show, deteriorate and destroy these institutions that are effectively useless now, that have been totally taken over, and build our own centers of power.
Okay.
So that way we can use those to take back society.
It's really interesting. I think this is what we obviously have to do, right? We have to find ways and create alternative economy, essentially, in order to be able to do that. Because power, money, influence, right? All these things. And to your point about like personnel is policy. I mean, one of the best examples of that is on the Supreme Court, right? Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court, like, what's interesting is what we're not advocating for as conservatives is people who will make the law that they want. When we get conservative judges, we don't want them to create law, right? We want them to appropriately interpret the laws that were passed by Congress, even if we don't necessarily like the laws that were passed by Congress. We want Congress to pass the laws that we like, and the Supreme Court to uphold the laws that have been passed by Congress, right? Whereas the liberals will legislate from the bench, right? And that's what we got with, not only the liberals, but primarily the liberals. Like because when Roe versus Wade was passed as an example, there actually were conservatives who signed on to that, quote unquote conservatives. I don't know what.
Yeah.
I don't think I couldn't, because that was such bad law and needed to be repealed. Not just because I disagree with like the outcome, but because it was built on this this faulty argument that did not make sense legally, which is why it needed to be repealed. Because basically, effectively, they were legislating from the bench, which is not their job. And so, again, it is possible that conservatives may occasionally, violate their oath, essentially, but it is common for the Democrats and liberals to do that, right? Which is why you have the justices that oppose that, despite the fact that it was good law. It was actually upholding the actual laws of the land rather than trying to legislate from the bench. Yeah. So personnel, I was going to say something else about power centers, I think. Well, yeah, what's also really interesting about that is I was having a conversation with a member of the news media here in Maine. And I may have shared this on a podcast earlier, but I don't care. But he shared with me that he was concerned that we as a country are not trusting our institutions, essentially.
Yeah.
And there's the kind of the thought process behind that, I think, is one that makes sense, which is that a society that doesn't trust its institutions can't really function very well, right? We're going to devolve into chaos, right? Well, but why? We have to ask the question. This is what I said to him. I was like, but why don't we trust the institutions?
Yeah.
Maybe it's because the institutions who are claiming to be the arbiters of truth are telling us that boys can be girls. Maybe it's that we have the people who are in charge of things like the Federal Reserve are telling us things that our eyes know are not true. Like in late 2021, when anybody who was paying attention economically knew in May of 2020 that inflation was coming like a storm. That was even before. That was just after the SAVE Act. What was it?
Big Beautiful Bill.
No, it was the HEROES Act that got passed. Big Beautiful Bill was more. That was 2025.
Yeah.
No, this is 2020. I can't remember what was the first act that they passed. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It was the first act to try and get us through the COVID-19 pandemic. As soon as they passed that, we knew inflation was coming. Later on, you had a few. Trump passed the HEROES Act as he was on his way out, and then Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act and a bunch of other things that incredibly increased inflation in our country. But and all of that had happened, all those bills had happened. And anybody who's paying attention to economics is when you print this much money, inflation comes like a storm, right? And Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, in late 2021 was saying, this is supply chain disruption, it's not inflation. It's dude, you're a liar. Either you're an idiot and you have no business being in your position, or you're just a politician who's lying to people, obviously. And I think it's the latter. I don't think he's that dumb. I don't think you get to the point of being Fed chair if you're that stupid. Corrupt, yes. Stupid, no. And there's other things that he had done that lead me to believe that he's not that stupid. And so when the institutions are telling you things that your eyes tell you are not true, you begin to distrust the institutions. And so but in order for us to trust the institutions need to become trustworthy. And how that happens is we need to take control of them.
Yeah.
Right. And the centers of power, as you're kind of talking about, makes sense. And how we do that is by seizing other centers of power, and which makes a lot of sense. But their ideology. It's interesting saying that. It feels very that's the Marxist ideology, right? This is communistic ideology that they've purported and they've used, and we as Republicans, conservatives, independents, libertarians, we just want to be left alone, but they won't let us, essentially. Yeah. So practically, those are some things that on a larger scale. But how do we do that locally? Because again, we're focused here. One of the things I'm heavily focused on, both in terms of my role as the chair of the Cumberland County Republicans, but also even on this podcast, I'm really trying to educate the people of Maine on what can you do? Because that all feels massive, and it feels oh my gosh, how do we take over and shift this. It feels hopeless. They've got so much power and control. They control the media. They control, that's why I say this podcast exists to help the people of Maine really do what the media should be doing, which is inform the people.
Yeah.
But they fail to do it. And so we try to highlight the things that they don't want to talk about. And like this would be a conversation they absolutely would not want to talk about, because they're one of those power centers that's held and controlled by the Democrat Party or by their operatives, whatever you want to call it. And so like it feels like such a daunting task that it's like makes you feel hopeless, and why even try? But like what can we do at a meaningful level? What is Turning Point Action in particular, alongside all the other organizations that are trying to positively impact Maine politics? What is Turning Point Action doing practically? And then also, this is like a 7-part question, so answer whatever you want.
Yeah.
We'll continue. But like, the other question is like, what are other things that people can do to be able to push back?
Yeah.
And help?
Well, it all comes back to the power centers and the institutions of society. And here in Maine, as in any more local political entity, the main power center is going to be the church. 110% is always going to be the church. Because without the church, all politics is ultimately religious, right? It all comes down to religious worldviews about who are we as human beings, what does it all mean, and why are we here? Those are religious questions. And so when we're talking about political questions, we have to look at the church and what is the church doing. And the church here in Maine has been compromised. It has been taken over by leftists at almost pretty much every single level imaginable. Like I'm a Catholic, and when I came up here, I was really, really surprised to see how liberal so many of the priests were and the congregations were, especially in Virginia. Our priests, they're super conservative down there. We have a bunch of really young priests who are on fire for the Lord and are very, very conservative. But up here, it's not the case. So seeing that's very, very upsetting. Seeing, driving past all the Episcopal churches with all their pride flags out front, all the mainline Protestant churches aren't doing much better than the Catholics. And so we have to focus on retaking those churches. We have to, like those churches, without those, we're lost as a society. And so long as the liberals control those as primary power centers, we will never be able to do well. So we have to go to those churches. We have to attend those churches. We have to take up positions in those churches, even when the people in those churches don't always want us there, because they understand that personnel is policy, that if you have conservatives in offices of power within the church, they're going to slip on that power center. And so that's the primary thing.
What's one of the best examples of that, or the churches? Okay, so number one, obviously, for a lot of people, there's like alarm bells going off while you're saying that, right? Because they're like, wait a second, church, separation of church and state, which is, I'll let you talk about that because I'm sure you've got a response for that, which is like, but it's a, sometimes when I'm in the church, I talk about bad theology. Yeah. This is like a really piss poor understanding of the actual laws that exist in our country, as well as where that statement came from, which was actually originally John Locke. But anyway, that's a whole other story. I say originally, that's at least where I learned it was from Locke. But I think that influenced some of the early founding fathers. But it's but also like, so actually, I'll let you speak to that, and then we'll get into the some of the other challenges or examples of that that I've seen in the churches, specifically since the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Go ahead.
Yeah. So separation of church and state, for one, that line appears nowhere in the Constitution. It does not exist at all in the Constitution. When people refer to the separation of church and state in the First Amendment, they're referring to the Establishment Clause, which doesn't exist in the First Amendment. It exists in Article 1 of the Constitution. And it says that Congress shall make no law respecting the practice or institution of any religious body. So the phrase separation of church and state does not exist there. The only
which that effectively is just saying people can worship freely. It's like it's similar to the idea of what's in the First Amendment, which is freedom of religion, right? It's essentially just highlighting that.
Sure. And what it's saying is Congress cannot explicitly establish a church. That is the point of the law. Right. That is the point of the clause in Article 1.
Because that would essentially, I think the view and the viewpoint and the reason that was there is I think because there was fear that if the state
Yeah.
did establish a church, then it would violate the freedom of religion, because there would be a push from the government to get people in line with the church, with with the religion pushed by the government. And so that's not. But again, in neither one of those statements is there anything about separation of church and state.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And so where we get that line, separation of church and state, from, I'm not aware of the Locke quote. It probably does exist. That sounds like something he would say.
I studied the history of Western philosophy, I think is what it was. It was the course that I took.
Yeah.
And Locke was one of the people that we studied, and that was one of the things that he talked about. I think that's where Thomas Jefferson got the
Thomas
term
Jefferson,
from.
yeah.
And that's where we get the term from.
Yeah.
Is from Thomas Jefferson. But go ahead.
Yeah, he says there has to be a wall of separation of church and state. He's writing this line to Patrick Henry. They historically hated each other, specifically over the religion question. And Thomas Jefferson wrote that earlier in his life. And if you compare Thomas Jefferson's earlier writings to his later writings, he was kind of a huge liberal when he was younger, and then becomes, after the French Revolution, becomes significantly more conservative as he sees a lot of his liberal ideas manifest themselves in the French Revolution.
The godless French Revolution that is highly unsuccessful comparative to the more Christian focused revolution here in America.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that line comes into play in public policy. It was a court case in the 60s called Yoder v. Wisconsin. In Yoder v. Wisconsin, said it had to do with homeschooling and is public schooling compulsory, that kind of question. And that's where that line begins to take hold in public policy. Again, people legislating from the bench, like you were talking about earlier. Yep. It's a huge problem, and it's been entirely misunderstood by our society.
Okay. So that's the government side of separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution as we did. I'm pretty sure in the letter that Jefferson was writing, the point was actually talking about the fact that basically the government couldn't influence the church was the direction that he was arguing, from what I've heard. I've not read the full statement, but either way, the point is him writing a letter is not law. He's a founding father, but he is not inspired. I'm just kidding. But joking about there was not law. It was an opinion of one of our founding fathers. It was not the law. Again, eventually people try to legislate from the bench. It's important to note that. On the flip side, before we get into the Charlie Kirk stuff that I do want to get into, it does seem like there's also serious concern from within the churches about not wanting to be political.
Yeah.
Right. And this fear that somebody saying, well, we've got to take over the churches for political reasons seems scary. Yeah.
And what I would say to that is, again, politics is religious. We're dealing with fundamental questions about the human condition. We're dealing with anthropology, which asks the question, what are we? Why are we here? What does our history say about us? What significance do we have? We see that come into questions of abortion. When does human life begin? We see that come into questions of transgenderism. What does what correlation, if any, does our biological sex have to our metaphysical selves? Those kinds of questions, we deal with them in public policy, but those are fundamentally metaphysical, spiritual, and therefore religious questions. And the argument that we can't bring God into politics, you can't believe that as a Christian, because all throughout the Old Testament, you see God raising up kings to rule as he commands them to rule. You see King David, you see King Saul, King Solomon, right? These were men who ruled, more or less, they were sinful men. They had their downfalls, but these were men who were given explicit instructions on how to rule by God. And when they followed those instructions, things went well. And when they didn't go well. Yeah. So it's totally inconsistent from a Christian standpoint.
No, I would agree. What's interesting is one of the biggest problems that we have in our churches, right? I think this is true at so many different levels, but I think about it in terms of churches because I used to work in campus ministry. I've been an elder in churches and a couple pastoral roles, youth pastor, evangelism pastor, whatever. Is it weird? we live in a day and age where we have access to more information than ever before, right? We have more commentaries on the Bible, and just so much easier access, more tools to like help us digest what's going on in Scripture. Like I think the Bible Project is one of the ones that people cite a lot. That's like been really helpful. They have these videos that really do a great job of explaining certain things. I don't necessarily agree with everything that they say. I don't know why I feel like I need to disclaim that about everything, but I do. Anyway, so we've got access to more information than ever before, and we are woefully ignorant of the Bible. Most people don't read a book of the Bible. They read individual verses and chapters occasionally, and they're like hyper focused on staying on the red letters in the New Testament, and focusing on Jesus' life or maybe the epistles or whatever. We have, like, somebody once told me that there's a reason that the majority of your Bible is the Old Testament, right? Like the New Testament is actually probably like 20% approximately of the actual Bible. And as Christians, like our theology suggests that we believe the whole Bible is the Word of God, and so the whole Bible matters. Now, there are elements of, we can interpret some aspects of the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. Jesus probably had it right. We could say, I think as Christians, we probably think that he had it right. If you don't, then maybe you're not a Christian, right? So there's elements of that, but the Old Testament is so foundational for understanding of how important even the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is. And to your point, like, so much of that, including what the prophets say. The prophets come and they preach to kings. I mean, they preach to the people, right? Yeah. But a lot of times they're trying to influence kings and essentially influence policy. In Jesus himself, what's interesting is, I actually had somebody, he came to this thing called Alpha, which is an evangelistic study trying to have people who are kind of exploring Christianity. And in it, this guy made the argument that Jesus was primarily a failed political figure. He wasn't seeing Jesus as a theological figure. Yeah. He was seeing Jesus as a failed political figure, but an accidentally successful religious figure. Yeah, which is really interesting, because like so much of our church, I think on the conservative, the more conservative side, which I think has been infiltrated, to your point, have been pushed away from politics to such a degree that they miss that Jesus was actually very political. In fact, he was killed because of the political implications of the things that he was saying. Mm-hmm. He wasn't coming to be elected. He wasn't trying to become high priest. But the high priests and the priests in general and the religious leadership, which was a political organization, were threatened by him. And then again, we go to Pontius Pilate, and his decision to have Jesus crucified actually is a political decision as well. So there's so much politics that exists, but definitely in the Old Testament, but even with Jesus, that like thinking that Christians are not to be political. I mean, John the Baptist is another great example from the New Testament, right? John the Baptist is preaching truth to the King Herod, and is killed as a result of it, right? Like, and somehow Christians have kind of fallen into this pattern in the conservative wing of the Christian church, where we're afraid to talk about politics for fear that we might not be able to reach people for Jesus. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. There's so many elements. We could probably spend hours just talking about this, and I'd enjoy that. But I don't know how helpful it'd be for everybody at home. But I think, like, anyway. So I think it's really interesting that part of your tactic, part of your desire, is to kind of infiltrate the churches. You say infiltrate, that's probably like that. Like, it's gonna scare people, but like really, it's more about like purifying the churches and ensuring the churches are teaching the truth the way that they should be, teaching the actual whole counsel of God, rather than shying away from speaking certain truths because the leftists have taught them to be afraid to say those things for fear of outrage. Mm-hmm. And this gets at the Charlie Kirk stuff, right? And so when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, I heard all across southern Maine people going to church and being like, they didn't even talk about Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
And I even know a guy that I like and respect who didn't understand why, or didn't agree with as well, why like flags were half-mast for a political celebrity, as he put it.
Jeez.
And I was like,
Yeah.
This was a martyr for the faith. This is a man who believed in Jesus first and foremost, and secondarily believed that part of what our call is. So go back to Genesis 1. It says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? Secondarily, have dominion over all of creation, right? This is pre-fall, right? We want to fill the earth with people made in the image of God, and worshiping him as God. Right. And number two is to create a world that functions in line with, create culture, create institutions that are submissive to the will of God and to God. In the fall, this gets corrupted, and so we have to, not only do we make babies, right, but we also have to help people come to know Jesus, right? Like that's the part of helping people, filling the earth with people who worship him is helping people come to know Jesus. And we don't just create culture now, we also have to redeem and restore culture, right? Again, evidenced in Jesus when he gives us the Lord's Prayer, which one of the first things is your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So number one, we're taught to work for it. And number two, we're taught to pray that God will make it happen, that things on earth will be more in line with the truth of how things are in heaven. And so here you have Charlie Kirk, a man who lived his life to accomplish that task.
Yeah.
Right? And when he dies, related to the truth for reasons that were outworkings of the truth of his faith, our churches did not honor him as the martyr that he was.
Not one bit.
Many of them. Because for fear, I've heard from pastors that they had people in their congregation that said that they would not come if that is brought up, because they believed the lie that Charlie Kirk was a hateful political activist.
Yeah. There's a lot there. There's a lot you can unpack right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've been talking too long,
No.
so it's your turn.
Yeah.
But that's, I guess, kind of like what I'm trying to undergird here is like, I think that people, if they hear that we need to infiltrate the churches, it's actually not what it is. The churches have been infiltrated. We need to purify the churches because they should be acting in a way that is seeking to live out that cultural mandate from Genesis 1 and from the Lord's Prayer of trying to make this world in line with God's truth and not simply waiting around for the end to come and to be raptured or whatever, but we actually need to be at work. And where are the darkest places in our society? Well, Christians need to be there, not shying away from it and hiding in corners. I'm going to actually be preaching at my church, so this is all preparation for this, on Matthew, where it talks about not letting your light shine. The purpose of this sermon will not be to be political, but I also can't not talk about the importance and the necessity of engaging in public life while preaching through that. We have to engage. And Christians have largely disengaged because of bad theology, because people who have been impacted by what Ali Beth Stuckey calls toxic empathy have allowed that fear of essentially being upset of the people on the left who might be upset by the things that they say, impacting them and pushing them away from going to saying the things that are true, essentially.
Yeah. I think politics has kind of become a dirty word in popular discourse. It's seen as something that you're not supposed to bring up at the dinner table. You're not supposed to ever talk about. You have your own little political philosophies over here, and that's fine for you to talk about them, in private. But you're not supposed to bring them up in in polite society, and we have abandoned the political arena to. I don't know if you've ever heard of Patrick Deneen. He's a political science professor out of Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Regime Change, and in the book he talks about the managerial class, and it's specifically rising up out of COVID, but getting its foothold for the last few decades. And this managerial class, this kind of Politburo we have of experts and scientists and people who have figured out what Marx would call the science of history. These guys are the guys who get to deal with politics. These coastal elites, we leave the politics to them, and they get to go screw up our country however they see fit. And we'll just go off and we'll be in our churches and we'll get a watered down message of the gospel from pastors who are too afraid to cross that managerial class. And so as Christians and as pastors and as priests specifically, we have to get comfortable with not leaving the political arena to that managerial class. And that takes effort. That takes, we're going to have to get comfortable with having disagreements. We're going to have to get comfortable with having hard conversations. But if we don't, and if we're not comfortable, and if we're not having those conversations, then we're leaving it up to the powers that be to dictate our lives and to run our country for us. That's not self-government. That's not what our founders believed in.
And it's also not Christian. I mean, we are called to take every thought captive to the word of God. Every thought, including political thought. It has to be shaped. And we live in this, again, we're a republic, but a democratic republic, not like the Democratic Republic of China or whatever the heck. Some of these other places that are actually communist, but we actually are a republic that is democratically elect our leaders, and that means that we're the political class, all of us. We need to engage in it, and Christians need to engage in it, because if we don't, well, guess what the other side is? And somewhere around 40 million Christians, I heard, nationwide. I think these is evangelical Christians, so not even including Catholics that don't vote, but don't vote in presidential elections. Right? And imagine, we could easily sway the outcome of the election. If we mobilize people, we could pick our leaders.
We would never lose another election again.
And we would be able to shape the policies of this country in line with biblical truth, which also conservatives are in favor of, by and large. And so anyway, so it's really interesting. I think there is a definite need to help our churches move in a positive direction. What's interesting is a lot of these churches that are not interested in this and afraid to talk about Charlie Kirk in a way that recognizes him for the martyr that he is, are also not doing so well in terms of their membership. They're not growing. Young people, and especially in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, who you're like, I'm going to go to church. Well, guess which types of churches they chose? They didn't choose to go to the ones in the long run. Some of them went to churches that didn't talk about Charlie Kirk, but by and large, I think a lot of churches have grown as a result of that. Because people have gone to a lot of them, but the ones that are growing the most are the ones that are most willing to have those conversations. And so we're seeing that a lot of these churches that are afraid to engage in this are doing the same thing that the mainline denomination churches did 30 years ago, which is largely dying. Most of your mainline denomination churches who have embraced liberalism, who are churches of pride, essentially now that they're promoting LGBTQIA, all that stuff, those churches are largely dead. I mean, they're dead spiritually for sure, but they're also not, generally speaking, growing. Although what's interesting is more recently, because one of the things that you mentioned, these churches have gone so far away from being Christian that they are starting to grow now by attracting the Democrat crazies, who their Democrat Party for them is their religion. Right, liberalism is their religion, and they're religiously devoted to it. And so they're going to some of these churches of pride. They don't call it. I don't think the churches call themselves churches of pride. That's essentially what they are. They're more focused on some of the cultural issues, particularly things like that. They're really Marxist in disguise. But anyway, it's really interesting. But in terms of gospel representation, they're not trying to help people come to know Jesus at all. And so they're dead from that perspective. But anyway, it's interesting. We've kind of veered off what our top podcast normally focuses on, which is politics into religion, but there's this overlap here. I think it's an overlap that really matters a lot and is worth the discussion. But but I want to shift because I think there's work that needs to be done there. So we're talking about okay, so that's one of the things that we can do is actually get involved in our churches.
Yep.
And for those of us who are Christians, if you're not a Christian, Jesus is pretty cool. You should check him out. But I mean it. Give it a try. There's hope there. I mean, it's especially in a world in which it feels hopeless sometimes. We look at what's happening again, especially when you look at a larger scale, and you're like, oh my gosh, the Democrats have been executing on this plan. They have all the money. They have all the power centers. How is it possible that we're going to turn the tide? It's like if you don't believe in a higher power. You don't believe in Jesus or some sort of a higher power at the very least, it's hard to believe that there's hope, right? And if you're like a Star Wars fan and you're like the Force, this benign, there's something out there that's or even the Lord of the Rings, which is heavily Christian themed. It's an allegorical, and Gandalf is sharing with Frodo that you were meant to find, Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and you were meant to have it, right? There's this sense that there is this ultimate good power out there, even if you haven't embraced Christianity. I got to encourage people to do that, but the truth is like if you don't have some sort of hope from something bigger, it can be very miserable to be a conservative right now because it feels heavy. I mean, the fact that here in the state of Maine, a state with some of the hardworking, common sense people historically is on the verge of, or I don't think they will, but the fact that it's even a question that they might embrace a guy who had a Nazi tattoo for 18 years and lied about knowing that it was a Nazi tattoo. So not only did he have something so awful and evil tattooed to his body, but he's actively lying about knowing it. And people that were on his campaign staff when he first started running are saying, no, he knew what it was. He had it for 18 years. He told his previous girlfriends what it was called. He knows what it is. He's a World War II buff, supposedly. This guy who did unspeakable things, porta potties. I mean, I can't look at a porta potty the same. I was at a Hearts of Pine game recently, and I was like, should I take a picture of the porta potty and say I didn't find Plattner here? I don't it's just it's a bit wild. This character, this is just that's the iceberg. There's a lot more underneath, and these are just and there's so much more that we could say about this guy. I mean, a communist who trained transgender people to be effective at shooting guns, right? During 2020 or whatever. This is a dangerous individual in all reality. The pretend oyster farmer who sold oysters to his mom and got what is it? He got I think a $20,000 non-repayable loan to be able to fund his oyster farm. And anyway, this character, the idea that a guy like that even has a chance at winning an election in Maine is very overwhelming, right? So anyway, I'm painting this picture to say okay, that's crazy, but so how one of the things you can do if you want to help and you're a Christian, get involved in your church and speak up, and don't allow this kind of Marxist ideology that's kind of this toxic empathy that's invaded the church to convince people to say that it's not okay to speak about politics. It doesn't mean that people have to be sitting there saying Republican to say that we need to be involved in politics and support conservative values, which ultimately gets them to the place where your really only choice at this point is to vote for a Republican, or if there's an independent running against a Democrat, vote for the independent, and support and help those people. But yeah, I think there's that. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Right. But what else can people do?
Yeah. So
I know I've talked way too much.
No,
on this
it's
podcast,
great.
But
so for Turning Point, we're going to be doing a bunch of obviously door knocks, get out the vote stuff, but we practice something called relational organizing, which is basically the idea. If you're an organizer, if you're a political operative, the first conversation you should be having someone you're trying to move to the polls should not be about politics. Because like I said, politics, like it or not, it's a dirty word, right? And people don't want to talk about it a lot of times. And if you walk up to somebody and say, hey, who are you voting for? Are you voting for Bobby Charles? Are you voting for Hannah Pingree? they're gonna flip you the bird and walk away, right? That's how a lot of people respond, especially up here, especially with a state with a lot of independents that don't really like politics.
Mhm.
You know, that's how they'll respond. So when we do relational organizing, we're doing fun community activities that, hey, while you're here, there's a voter registration table over there. You should go register to vote. Hey, while you're here, you know, playing, you know, volleyball or, you know, cornhole or grilling, whatever the event is, you know, a local state rep candidate is going to come up and say a few words or like bless the food or something. You know, it's going to be a little meet and greet. So having a, you know, that's what we're going to be focusing on for the foreseeable future, is just telling people that, hey, politics isn't, you know, it's like what we talked about earlier with the managerial class and people running away from it, and say, hey, politics isn't something to be feared. It's something that we as a community ought to take the reins of. It's something that we can have a direct effect on without, you know, totally compromising our morals or, you know, totally giving ourselves over to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. I think that's really great. I think I don't know other people are doing much in the way of that. It's more like hit doors, do social media, which I think they're, again, I'm not saying
that's important.
Yeah,
right?
these are you know, aspects of the strategy that we need to deploy on and, you know, help candidates, give money, all that kind of stuff. I wonder too, like giving money is one that's been interesting recently. And I think we talk about politics itself being seen as dirty. And I'm trying to convince Christians to give money to politics. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean,
because I think like I'll just kind of like lay it out and then let you respond. But I've had conversations with a number of people. Again, I used to work in campus ministry, right? And so I got people to support me as a campus minister. And so I've reached out to some of those people since I've been involved in politics, and some of the people who gave to me when I was involved in campus ministry gave to me, you know, but others like initially were just like, yeah, I don't give to politics. I give to ministry. And I had one guy who actually gave to me when I was running like $50 or whatever. And then recently I wanted to I basically asked for some money to support an event we had coming up for the Cumberland County Republicans. And he's like, I only give to ministries. And, you know, and so like, how do we, like, what's the response? That's kind of the question. You get some people are just like, I'm not going to give to politics at all. Well, actually, that's essentially what it is. This guy made this one exception. The only money he's ever given to politics was $50 to me because he's got a relationship with me. But yeah, I guess, how do you respond to that? And how do we encourage people? Because, like it or not, money impacts politics substantially. So
yeah. So specifically, if we're talking to Christians here, I would go back to the story of Nehemiah. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story, but basically, the Jews have been expelled from Jerusalem for 70 years at this point, and Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, tells him to go back, and he appoints Nehemiah to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so when Nehemiah gets back and he gathers all the Jews in Jerusalem together, and he starts giving out instructions on how to rebuild the walls. And he says to this group to build this certain section of the wall, and then to this group to build another section of the wall. And he delegates the task out. And each group is doing something to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that are unique and significant to that group, the thing that they can do best. The reason I bring that up, you know, me as a college student, I can't go out here and cut $100,000 checks to a political campaign, right? But what I can do is I can organize, I can knock doors, I can do the grunt work. That's the section of the wall that I have to rebuild. Now, if you're someone who can't or doesn't want to get out and knock doors, your section of the wall might be to give to those political campaigns or those organizations. You know, it's not enough to just sit and even just to vote, frankly, at this point is not enough. You have to be involved in the fight or in the process in some way or another. And if that process doesn't look like on the ground organizing and voter mobilization, you got to find some other way. And for a lot of people, I think the best way that they could give would be financially.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think like one of the things like to think about, I think Christians, we have this mistake that we make, we Christians, and it's something that Francis Schaeffer actually claimed was a viewpoint Francis Schaeffer, by the way, incredible guy. Had a significant impact on the evangelical movement initially, the fundamentalist movement, until that kind of went south, and he kind of jumped over. We'll say he's actually initially a little bit critical of the evangelical movement, but he eventually joined it and was one of the leaders of it, thought leaders for sure. He was an interesting character. I read a book on him in which it kind of described that he was a guy who didn't actually read a lot of books, but he had conversations with people. And so from conversations with people and people's understanding of Aquinas, which was a misunderstanding of what Aquinas was actually trying to say. Aquinas was a really smart guy who wrote some really big books.
Yeah.
And so it's understandable that people might get confused in writing and reading his complex books. But however, I think this idea of a secular sacred divide, this idea that there are certain things that we do that are secular, certain things that we do are sacred, has some of its roots in a misunderstanding of Aquinas. I may be wrong about that. Feel free to fact check me. I don't care. But either way, we have that in our society. We have this thing that, like, again, this is part of what I ended up having a conversation with this friend of mine, and I was like, we don't have a secular versus sacred split in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say anywhere give things to Christian ministries. In fact, the word Christian doesn't exist. People were called Christians actually initially as a slur, right, at one point in the Bible. But there is no Christian ministries that are described. It doesn't say give money to Christian ministries. But what it does say, when we talk about things like giving and tithing, the point in tithing is not that God needs your money, right? It's that all of your money, all of your resources, everything that you have is a gift from God and belongs to God, which means in the point there, and part of the practice that helps you realize, if you think about it and you're paying attention, is that I need to make sure that everything that I have is being used for the sake of advancing God's kingdom and growing God's kingdom. And that includes socially, culturally, politics, right? So we give 10% to the church as a reminder that all of our money is owned. And again, sometimes it is a hyper focus on the money side of it, but really we're supposed to be giving 10% of everything.
Yeah.
All of our resources. What do you have? Maybe you don't have money, like you said. What part of the wall are you building? And if you have, so whether it's giving time, energy, and effort to politics, because this hits the whole thing, because I think Christians are afraid to engage in this, again, because of a lot of nonsense. But we need to engage in this, and we need to financially engage in this, because guess what the other side is? And guess what? They're winning right now. Yeah. They've been winning in our country. Like, it's actually pretty amazing that Republicans have done as well as they have, given how bad our strategy has been and how little people actually give and volunteer compared to the Democrats.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's just an admonition for Christians. How do people, get connected and get involved if they want to be involved in Turning Point Action here in Maine?
There's a lot of ways to do that. The best way would be to go to tpaaction.com/coalitions. I'll say that again, tpaaction.com/coalitions. If you simple sign up, takes a minute to do so, to fill that out. My work email is andrew.mcknight@tpaction.com. People are free to reach out to me on there as well. If you're a pastor or a business owner and you have a church and you want to be involved, we have a program where pastors can actually include a link to voter registration on their website. It's called @vote. I think it's called @vote.com/partnership is the way to sign up for that. Otherwise, they can just shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to get any pastors or business owners on that. But those are the best ways to do so, is through tpaaction.com/coalitions. And that's how to get on our email list and learn about all our events.
Yeah, and then also the events that you're going to do; those are places to go. And some of those you'll have more information coming out in the near future, coming soon, which would be great. Because and I think it's important. Like, one of the things that you kind of had indicated earlier, probably not on the podcast, maybe we were talking beforehand, is that the strategy here of what Turning Point Action is trying to do in Maine, it is about like doing something soon for this election cycle, but it's not limited to this election cycle. You didn't just move here for 6 months.
No, we're playing the long game here. Our strategy, my main concern right now is to defeat Graham Plattner. I think he's extremely dangerous. The ideology that he represents is extremely dangerous. And if we demonstrate that a Democrat like that can win an election against an incumbent like Susan Collins, that sets a very dangerous precedent for Democratic primaries going forward.
All across the country,
absolutely.
Really. Yeah. Maine is a petri dish
Mm-hmm.
At this point, or an experiment. Yeah, go ahead.
I know, like over the last few days, I've seen on Twitter a lot this group, the Democrat Socialists of America, the DSA. They've been the talk ever since the Mamdani endorsed primary guys. All those guys won. The DSA has been a big topic of discussion for political operatives, and it's a very, very dangerous group. The fact that we're talking about that group as a legitimate political force is very, very dangerous. It shows you leftists, they always do this. They'll say, Joe Biden was really on the right. He just seemed on the left comparatively to the rest of our politics. That's totally not true. Like, I hear that argument all the time. And I think the fact that we're seeing guys like Graham Plattner run on the ballot is evidence that that is not true. The fact that we're seeing groups like the Democratic Socialists of America be so popular is evidence that that's not true. And so right now we have to beat him. We have to beat him to tell the Democrats that you can't put a socialist up. We have to beat him by a lot. It can't just be by a little. It has to be by a lot. And it's that Overton window again that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
We have to keep that Overton window as far to the right as possible. And so beating him is the number one strategy. On top of that, playing the long game. My job here in Maine is to build out our list of contacts, our list of volunteers, so that I can go back to Turning Point and say, hey, Maine Republicans actually still have some fight left in them. They're not totally beat yet, because if Turning Point wants to play more in Maine in the future, if they want to put more money into Maine, no amount of money is going to make up for apathy. No amount of money is going to make up for people just not caring. And so I have to be able to demonstrate to them that Mainers do actually care. And so doing that on top of beating Graham Plattner is the primary focus.
Yeah, and I think I think that's great. I think a couple of things that I think I just like to I think people are afraid of Graham Plattner, and I think the momentum around him is definitely concerning. Obviously, I think it's important to note too that 28% of people showed up to the primary to vote not for him.
Literally,
right? Like that's significant, right?
It's very significant.
Especially because Mills was on the ballot, but she wasn't running, right? She was done. She knew that she'd lost. She'd given up. People still showed up and voted for her. And then, 6%, something like that, showed up and voted for Dan Costello, who everybody knew had no chance of winning, right? So when you get 28% of the people voting against your candidate, that is very significant. The favorite, even though he didn't win the primary, the guy who had the most individual support on the Democrat side of the gubernatorial ticket, Nirav Shah, was not endorsed by Plattner. Again, the coalition carried Hannah Pingree, but it took a coalition, an organization, to ensure that the one of the three Plattner endorsed candidates came out on top, and only barely, right? So, the reality is there's not as much support even within the Democrat Party for this guy as there sometimes feels like there is. The other thing I think that's important to note here is people look at what happened with Mamdani. Now let's talk about a couple of things. Mamdani was running against who?
Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Lewa.
Yeah, and who's Curtis Lewa?
He's
I'm just being a little
he's a Republican.
He's a Republican, great guy. No offense to him, but he's not necessarily a very terribly. He was not he didn't have a lot of name ID. Right, and he was running in a state in an area that was 65% Democrat. Okay, right. Really tough for a Republican to win that kind of seat, especially when you had an independent candidate, Andrew Cuomo, who tried to win the Democrat primary and lost. One of my questions around this is what the heck was Andrew Cuomo, the disgraced former governor? Right. What was he doing? What were they doing trying to put him up against Mamdani? Right. It almost feels like you're trying to lose and make it look like you're not trying to, or we have nothing better to consider. Well, let's try and throw this guy at it. It's this guy was a terrible opponent, and arguments can be made for Mills against Plattner as well. However, one of the big differences here is in the general election, we're not going up against like the number one opponent for the Mamdani type candidate, which is Graham Plattner, is not disgraced former governor, Andrew Cuomo or anything like that. It's stateswoman Susan Collins, which I think, not everyone 100% loves and agrees with absolutely everything about Susan Collins. But one thing, there's a lot of things you got to give her. She has been very consistent historically on who she is, what she supports, how she plans to represent the people of Maine, and she has executed on that at a level that is kind of unprecedented.
Yeah.
She 10,000 consecutive votes, more than that now, never missed a vote, and has always, like, in a world where people clamor for an honest politician, like, I don't know how you get more upfront and honest than Susan Collins. And, like, if you don't like how conservative she isn't, we've got work to do here in the state of Maine. If we want an actual, like, true traditional conservative to be able to be elected, well, first of all, don't vote for Graham Plattner, right? Like, because that's crazy in the other direction. Right. But, like, more to the point is, like, if you wanted somebody better than her in terms of how conservatives view things, well, we've got to change the culture here in Maine, because unless we change the culture, that's just not possible. I don't believe it'd be very, very difficult. And I don't see the scenario in which that happens in the current environment. And so we got to focus on that and not just complain about the fact that she's not as conservative as we might like her to be. Yeah. But again, she represents Maine really well, and is obviously the much more conservative option. And in large part, in a lot of the major issues, we'll vote with us when we need her to, which is, I think, really important. So anyway, I just like to highlight that. It's like, so I think the person that she is, like, this is not a disgraced person like Andrew Cuomo. So I believe we'll win that. I believe we'll win that going away. And I'm really hopeful that we're going to be able to make that statement and say, not on our watch, not here in the state of Maine. We are not to the degree that we're going to allow a communist, a Nazi, lying sack of to be able to win an election and try to represent and go to Washington D.C. or quote unquote represent Maine. I think we're gonna send him packing pretty quick. That's my hope. So
I agree.
Yeah. So you guys are going to be working on trying to do some get out the vote efforts for a number of Republican candidates across the state. And again, if people want to get involved in that, they'll reach out the way that you described before. Anything else you want to share or you want to talk about before we wrap things up? I feel like we've had a good, robust conversation, but is there anything else that you feel like was missed that is really important for people to know?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to Charlie, I was at the Lincoln County Republican meeting earlier this week talking to those guys, and I kind of hit on Charlie's life and his legacy to those guys. And just to kind of rehash what I said to them, we're living right now in a very unique political moment where for the first time in really 30 years, the Republican Party and the conservative movement is really in power, right? These aren't McCain Republicans. These aren't Romney Republicans who are, just kind of go along to get along. These are Trump Republicans. These are guys who are tough, who understand the political moment, and that's great. On the flip side of that, the Democrats also know that. They know the political moment is very precarious for them, and they're lashing out as such. They're, I describe them as like a cornered animal, almost.
Which makes them dangerous, right?
Extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's why I think we're seeing such a rise in, I think they're turning up the heat of the rhetoric. I think they're becoming more and more violent, is because they understand that their place in history, that was so dominant for so long, is now being called into question. And so with that knowledge, I think it's more important now than ever that we stick together as not just a political alliance, but as a community, as a family in our institutions. The few that we still do control, and to support each other in infiltrating the other institutions that we have to take over. And understanding that these are the same Democrats. Father's Day, for example, I want to talk about this. last Father's Day, they put a little message in our Telegram chat with all the Turning Point staff, and it was talking about how this is the first Father's Day that the Kirk family won't have their father. And that, that had me thinking about a lot of things, and especially this Pride Month. I've gotten so many DMs from strangers on, different Facebook pages. I think you and I know the one that I'm referring to. But so many comments and DMs from those guys saying, "Oh, it's Pride Month. What happened to Charlie? He's been really quiet lately." Stuff like that. Like, we cannot coexist with a political climate like this. We can't exist with a political faction that actively does not want to coexist with us. And so we have to understand that we have to be using to wield political power as such to be able to silence, through legal means, not calling for vigilantism, but
right.
If people are going to go out and call for violence, they need to face legal consequences for it. If people are going to go out and commit violence, they need to face legal consequences for it. That goes for the activist space, and it goes for the politicians. And we have to get a lot more comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think the Trump administration needs to do is actually prosecute people who.
I agree.
I think this is one of the biggest frustrations with the Trump administration by the conservative base and the libertarians, is that there are people that perpetrated evil and have gotten away with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a story as old as time in a lot of ways in American history, but I think it's something that I'd like to see. Sounds like that might be coming, but I'd really like to see it. And so it would help, if people didn't get away with their crimes.
Yeah.
So.
I know I saw a lot of posts on X over the last week. It was like, we had a really great opportunity after Charlie's murder to crush the political left, to start sending federal agents to the homes of these Antifa members, to start kicking in doors and hauling people off, in police vans. And we just didn't.
Yeah.
And we let that political moment slip, and we can't afford to let another one pass by us. Yeah.
Yeah. And free speech, absolutism, but when people commit crimes, they need to be prosecuted and legally, right? Like this, I want to be clear, because these crazy people will take things out of context and try to make it like we're in favor of violence. No, not in any way in favor of violating the Constitution. I was really happy that when Pam Bondi overstepped and said that we're going to go after people who say bad things. It's like, well, no, free speech, as long as you're not violating laws around, trying to organize people to commit crime, right? That's not protected speech under the First Amendment, right? But as long as you're not violating the laws, in that kind of way, we're pro free speech, and we're against I'm against anyway. If I can say for sure that some of the rhetoric that Pam Bondi eventually walked back, which was good in response to the Republicans telling her to back off, right? I think this is one of the beauties. So the Democrats are not going to go after their people for silencing free speech. We will. If our leaders are trying to silence free speech, we will hold them. We proved it in that situation. We'll hold them accountable. But if people were violating the laws, you're getting at, we did miss an opportunity there, because there are a lot of people who were doing some horrible things and have not been prosecuted for it. And so hopefully that's more that's coming. I know that the auto pen, forgave people. But what's interesting about the auto pen is it actually does not have the ability to forgive people for violating state laws, only federal laws. So some of these people, I think we should be able to the states would have to go after them. But I think that needs to happen with some of these people who perpetrated evil on the American people. So anyway, all that being said, So thank you, Andrew, for joining us. Thank you for coming to Maine and trying to help us, bring common sense policy making and policy making in line with a Christian worldview, with conservative worldview, back to power here in Maine, so that we can live in this incredibly beautiful state with incredibly beautiful people, but not be oppressed by our government, not have children mutilated by quote unquote doctors, and restore the institutions to the greatness that they once had. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Too.
Thank you guys all for watching. We'll be back here, I think Tuesday, maybe with John Featherston, maybe with David Whitney. I think that's what those are the scheduled. So we'll see you back here on